Eric Thompson had always considered himself a fortunate man. At 34 years old, he had built a life many people would envy. He grew up in a small town in Ohio, the son of a hard-working mechanic and a loving school teacher. After putting himself through college with scholarships and part-time jobs, Eric had climbed his way up the corporate ladder. Now he was a successful project manager at a tech firm in Chicago, earning enough to live comfortably in a spacious apartment in the city. Despite the long hours and the stress of his job, Eric always found solace in the one constant in his life: his wife, Jessica. Jessica was a year younger than him, 33, and had grown up in the same small Ohio town. The two had met during their college years, crossing paths at a mutual friend's party, and had been inseparable ever since. Jessica was everything Eric thought he needed: bright, kind-hearted, and full of ambition. She had studied interior design and now ran her own business, catering to high-end clients in the Chicago suburbs. They'd married 5 years ago in a picturesque ceremony in the rolling hills of Ohio, surrounded by family and friends. Eric had always believed their love was unshakable. What made their relationship even more special, in Eric's eyes, was the closeness of Jessica's family. Jessica had a twin sister, Rebecca, who was married to Tom, a high school football coach. The four of them would often spend weekends together, going on double dates or hosting dinner parties. It was the kind of tight-knit relationship Eric had always valued, and he was proud of how their lives intertwined so harmoniously. He never imagined that the people he trusted most would be the ones to unravel his world. It was a crisp autumn day when Eric first felt the unsettling tug of suspicion. He had been traveling for work, a routine business trip to New York that required him to spend 3 days away from home. Jessica had been supportive, as always, texting him sweet messages and even sending pictures of their dog, Max, to keep him updated on life at home. But on the second day, something felt off. She wasn't as responsive as usual, and when he called her that evening, her voice sounded distant, distracted. Eric brushed it off as stress. Jessica had recently taken on a new high-profile client, and he assumed her mind was preoccupied with the pressures of work. By the third day, however, Eric's unease had only grown. He had finished his meetings earlier than expected and was given the green light to return to Chicago a day ahead of schedule. It was a pleasant surprise, and he imagined how happy Jessica would be when he walked through the door earlier than planned. As his plane touched down at O'Hare International Airport, Eric couldn't help but feel excited. It was rare that he got to come home early, and he envisioned a quiet evening at home with his wife, a bottle of wine, takeout from their favorite Italian place, and maybe even a movie. He texted Jessica to let her know he had landed, but strangely, she didn't reply. It wasn't like her to ignore his messages, especially when he was out of town. Eric shrugged it off, assuming she was in the middle of a meeting or handling one of her client's demands. He grabbed his luggage, hopped into a cab, and headed home, eager to surprise her. As the taxi navigated through the familiar streets of their upscale neighborhood, Eric glanced at his phone, still no response from Jessica. He felt a small knot tighten in his stomach, but pushed it aside. Jessica wasn't the type to cheat, and Tom and Rebecca lived only a few blocks away, so he assumed she was possibly over at their house, helping Rebecca with something. It was normal for the sisters to lean on each other. Finally, the cab pulled up in front of their modern townhouse. Eric paid the driver, grabbed his suitcase, and walked up the front steps. As he fumbled for his keys, he noticed something strange. Jessica's car was parked in the driveway. His heart skipped a beat. If she was home, why hadn't she answered his texts? Eric unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was quiet, eerily quiet. Max, their playful golden retriever, was nowhere to be seen, which struck him as odd. Max always greeted him at the door with an excited bark and a wagging tail. Eric set his suitcase down and walked through the hallway, his senses on high alert. That's when he heard it. Faint, muffled sounds coming from upstairs. At first, He thought Jessica might be watching TV, but as he stood at the base of the staircase, he realized the sounds weren't coming from the living room. They were coming from their bedroom. His heart raced. The sounds were unmistakable. Soft moans, a man's voice, and the rustling of sheets. Eric's body went cold, his mind refusing to register what was happening. 1,000 thoughts raced through his head, but one stood out clearly. No, not Jessica. It can't be her. His feet moved almost of their own accord as he climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he reached the top of the staircase, the noises grew louder, clearer. He could hear Jessica's voice now, breathless, the tone he recognized too well, one of pleasure. He clenched his fists, his entire body trembling with a mixture of fear, anger, and heartbreak. Eric paused outside the bedroom door, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He didn't want to open it. He didn't want to see the truth that lay on the other side. But he had to. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned the knob and pushed the door open. What he saw inside tore his world apart. There, tangled in the sheets of their bed, was Jessica, and she wasn't alone. Her naked body was intertwined with Tom, her sister's husband. The two of them were so engrossed in their passion that they didn't even notice Eric standing in the doorway, watching in silent horror as his wife betrayed him in the most unforgivable way. Tom was on top of her, his body moving rhythmically as Jessica moaned beneath him. Eric's stomach churned. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he watched the woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted with his entire heart, give herself to another man, his best friend, no less. The betrayal was like a dagger to his chest, sharp and relentless. For a brief moment, Eric considered storming into the room, yanking Tom off Jessica, and confronting them both. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the shock, maybe it was the disbelief, or maybe it was the cold realization that no confrontation could undo what had just happened. Instead, he took a step back, his hands trembling. He wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers, but no words came. His mind was too numb. Quietly, Eric turned and walked out of the house, his movements mechanical, as if he were on autopilot. He didn't stop until he reached the street, where he finally let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His mind raced as he tried to process the scene he had just witnessed. He felt like a stranger in his own life, like everything he had known up until that moment had been a lie. Jessica had been cheating on him, not just with any man, but with Tom, the husband of her own twin sister. The sheer audacity of the betrayal left Eric reeling. He couldn't wrap his head around it. How long had this been going on? How could she have done this to him? And why Tom? As he stood on the sidewalk, staring blankly at the traffic passing by, Eric knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. But instead of giving in to his emotions, Eric made a decision. He wouldn't confront Jessica or Tom, not yet. No, he would wait. He would plan his next move carefully, ensuring that when the moment came, his revenge would be as cold and calculated as their betrayal had been. That night, Eric stayed in a hotel, his mind racing with thoughts of how to handle the situation. He replayed the scene over and over in his head, unable to sleep, unable to think of anything else. The image of Jessica and Tom together was burned into his brain, a permanent scar on his heart. He wanted to hurt them the way they had hurt him. He wanted to make them feel the same level of devastation he felt now. Eric didn't know how long the affair had been going on, but he knew that when he returned home, he would no longer be the naive, trusting husband he once was. No, when he walked back into that house, he would be a man with a plan, and Jessica had no idea what was coming. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of the hotel room, casting a soft, golden glow across the bed where Eric lay, wide awake. He hadn't slept. His mind had been racing all night, a whirlwind of emotions, rage, disbelief, sorrow. But above all, it was the numbness that clung to him like a suffocating blanket, blocking out the feelings he should have been able to process. He felt hollow inside, like something vital had been ripped out of him and replaced with an aching void. The events of the previous day played on an endless loop in his mind. The sight of Jessica, her body entwined with Tom, haunted him relentlessly. Her moans of pleasure echoed in his ears, tormenting him, while Tom's grunts made Eric's blood boil. It wasn't just the physical act of betrayal that tore him apart. It was the intimacy, the raw emotion he had witnessed. It was as though the love he had believed to be exclusive between him and Jessica had been shared with another, as if she had stolen something sacred from their marriage and given it freely to someone else. By the time dawn had broken, Eric had made his decision. He wasn't going to scream or cry or demand explanations. No, his revenge would be quiet, cold, and precise. Jessica's world would crumble, just as she had shattered his. He got out of bed, feeling an unfamiliar sense of clarity. He couldn't stay in the hotel forever, and eventually he'd have to face Jessica. But this time, he wouldn't go back to her with open arms or a broken heart. He would return as a man with a plan, and she would never see it coming. After showering and dressing, Eric gathered his things and checked out of the hotel. The drive back to their townhouse felt surreal. He had driven these streets countless times before, but now everything seemed different. The houses, the trees, even the sky. It all seemed alien to him, like he was seeing the world through a new lens. Nothing was familiar anymore, because the life he thought he knew had been a lie. As he pulled into the driveway, Eric took a deep breath. Jessica's car was still there, parked in the same spot it had been the day before. His chest tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. Today wasn't about raw emotions. Today was about control. He grabbed his suitcase from the trunk and walked up the front steps, his hand hovering over the doorknob for just a moment before he pushed it open. The house was eerily quiet, just as it had been the previous day. Eric set his suitcase down and walked through the hallway, glancing around the living room. Everything looked exactly the same. The throw pillows neatly arranged on the couch, the framed pictures on the wall, the vase of flowers on the dining table. It was as though nothing had changed, but Eric knew better. He stood there for a moment, letting the silence wash over him before he heard the soft creak of floorboards upstairs. Jessica was home. The weight of the coming confrontation pressed heavily on him, but Eric steeled himself. He walked up the stairs, his movements deliberate and slow, his mind focused on what he needed to do. As he reached the top of the staircase, he saw her. Jessica was standing in their bedroom doorway, her face pale and drawn. She had clearly been waiting for him, perhaps dreading this very moment. Her eyes were wide, filled with panic, and her hands fidgeted nervously at her sides. She had always been so composed, so confident. But now, she looked small, vulnerable, like a woman on the edge of losing everything. Eric's heart twisted, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he moved past her without a word, heading straight for the closet. He could feel her eyes on him as he started pulling clothes off hangers and tossing them into a suitcase he had left out the night before. The sound of fabric kicking the leather suitcase filled the silence between them. "What the hell are you doing?" Jessica's voice cracked, breaking the tension in the air. Eric didn't look at her. He kept packing, methodical and emotionless, as if this were just another task on his to-do list. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stopped and turned to face her. "I came home yesterday," he said, his voice cold and calm. "A day early." Jessica's face turned white as the realization began to sink in. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in horror. "Eric," he cut her off. "I walked into this house and went upstairs. I heard you," he said, his eyes narrowing as he fought to keep his voice steady. "I saw you." Jessica's lips parted, but no words came out. She stared at him, her eyes filling with tears as she shook her head, as if denying the reality of the situation could somehow make it disappear. "Who was it?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Eric, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She took a step toward him, but he held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. "Don't," he said sharply. "Don't try to explain. Don't try to lie." Jessica's tears spilled over, streaming down her cheeks as she collapsed onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. She sobbed, her shoulders shaking violently, but Eric felt nothing. No pity, no sadness, just a deep, icy numbness that settled over him like a shroud. "I don't need an explanation," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I saw everything I needed to see." Jessica lifted her head, her tear-streaked face filled with desperation. "Eric, it was a mistake. I don't know why I did it. I was confused, and it just happened." Eric stared at her, his expression hard and unforgiving. "It didn't just happen, Jessica. You made a choice, and it wasn't a mistake." Her sobs intensified, and she reached out for him, but he took a step back, avoiding her touch. "Please, Eric," she begged. "Please don't leave me. We can fix this. We can go to therapy, talk about it. Anything. I love you." Eric laughed, a bitter, humorless sound that echoed through the room. "Love? Is that what you call what I saw yesterday? Is that how you show love? By crawling into bed with another man?" Jessica's face crumpled, and she shook her head. "It wasn't like that," she cried. "I wasn't thinking straight. I was lost, and Tom." Tom. Eric's voice hardened as he spoke the name, the venom in his words unmistakable. "Your sister's husband. You didn't just betray me, Jessica. You betrayed Rebecca, too." Jessica's sobs slowed, her expression shifting to one of pure terror. "Rebecca doesn't know," she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. "She doesn't know, Eric. Please, don't tell her. It would destroy her." The mention of Rebecca brought a new wave of anger crashing over Eric. Rebecca, Jessica's twin sister, her best friend, the woman who had trusted her with everything. The thought of Rebecca finding out, of the devastation it would cause, made Eric's heart ache. But even in the midst of his fury, he couldn't bring himself to punish Rebecca for Jessica's sins. She was innocent in all of this. "I don't owe you anything, Jessica," Eric said coldly, his voice void of emotion. "I won't protect your secret, but I won't be the one to tell her either." Jessica's eyes widened in panic. "Please, Eric," she begged. "Please don't leave me. I'll do anything. We can fix this. We can make it right." Eric stared at her, his heart hardened against her pleas. He had loved her once, more than he had ever loved anyone. But that love was gone now, replaced by something darker, something colder. There was no going back. "You can't fix this," he said, his voice low and steady. "What's done is done." With that, he turned back to his suitcase and zipped it closed. The sound of the zipper echoed in the silence, final and absolute. Jessica watched, helpless, as he grabbed the suitcase and walked toward the door. As he reached the threshold, she called out one last time. "Eric, wait." He paused, his back to her, but he didn't turn around. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice broken. For a moment, Eric stood there, the weight of her words hanging in the air. But then he shook his head, his resolve unshaken. "I hope it was worth it," he said, his voice cold and unfeeling. Without another word, he walked out the door and down the stairs, leaving Jessica sobbing on the bed behind him. As he stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, Eric felt a strange sense of relief. The hardest part was over. He had confronted her, exposed the truth, and now he was free. But there was still one more part of his plan left to execute. One final move to make sure the people who had betrayed him understood the full extent of what they had done. And that's when Eric's thoughts turned to Tom. Eric had been gone for nearly a week. During this time, he had taken refuge in a rented apartment across town. It was a modest place, nothing compared to his home with Jessica, but it was quiet and gave him the space he needed to think clearly. He used the time to reflect on his next steps, to plan his approach, and to come to terms with the painful reality of his situation. The initial days had been filled with a mix of numbness and anger. a swirling storm of emotions that made it hard to focus on anything besides the betrayal he had witnessed. But as the days passed, the anger settled into a cold, calculated resolve. Eric knew he couldn't simply walk away from this. There was something inside him that demanded justice, not just for himself, but for Rebecca, who was blissfully unaware of the treachery unfolding right under her nose. The decision to expose Jessica and Tom's affair to Rebecca was not one Eric made lightly. He knew it would cause immense pain, but he couldn't let them get away with their deceit. Rebecca deserved to know the truth, and Eric felt an obligation to ensure she did. On the sixth day, Eric decided it was time to put his plan into action. He had already reached out to Rebecca, under the pretense of needing to discuss something urgent about Jessica's business. She agreed to meet him at a coffee shop, a cozy little place that was always bustling with activity. The location was perfect. It provided a neutral ground for the confrontation he was about to orchestrate. Eric arrived early, giving himself time to settle his nerves. He found a table in a quiet corner and ordered a coffee, his hands gripping the cup as he waited. When Rebecca walked in, she looked as lovely as ever. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and she wore a warm, welcoming smile that seemed to light up the room. Eric's heart ached seeing her so innocent, so unaware of the storm that was about to hit her life. Eric. Rebecca's voice was bright and cheerful as she approached the table. She greeted him with a friendly hug, her warmth a stark contrast to the icy resolve he felt inside. "Rebecca, thank you for meeting me," Eric said, forcing a smile as he gestured for her to sit. Rebecca settled into the chair across from him, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Of course. What's going on?" "Jessica said you needed to talk to me about something." Eric took a deep breath. The weight of what he was about to do pressed heavily on him. "It's about Jessica," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's something you need to know." Rebecca's expression shifted to concern. "Is everything okay? Jessica's been acting a little off lately, but I thought it was just stress." Eric's stomach churned as he searched for the right words. "Rebecca, I need to be honest with you. What I'm about to tell you is going to be very difficult to hear." Rebecca's face grew pale, a flicker of unease crossing her features. "Eric, you're scaring me. Just tell me." Eric nodded, his resolve hardening. He pulled out his phone and, with a heavy heart, showed her a series of photos he had taken of Jessica and Tom together. Images that left no room for misinterpretation. The photos were discreet, but clear enough to convey the gravity of the situation. Rebecca's eyes widened in shock as she looked at the pictures. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she gasped, unable to tear her gaze away from the damning evidence. Her world seemed to tilt as she absorbed the betrayal laid bare before her. "Eric, I don't understand," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "How is this possible?" Eric watched as Rebecca's hands trembled, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know this is devastating," he said softly, "but it's the truth. Jessica and Tom have been having an affair. I saw them together myself, and I couldn't stand by and let you be kept in the dark." Rebecca shook her head, her expression a mix of disbelief and pain. "I trusted them both," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought they were happy, that they were loyal. How could they do this to me?" Eric reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on hers. "I'm so sorry, Rebecca. I wish there was a way to make this easier, but you deserve to know the truth." The minutes that followed were a blur of tears and broken sobs as Rebecca tried to process the betrayal. Eric stayed with her, offering what comfort he could, though he knew nothing he said would undo the hurt. As they left the coffee shop, Rebecca seemed lost in a daze, her eyes red from crying, her face pale and drawn. The drive home was quiet. Rebecca sat in the passenger seat, her mind clearly reeling from the revelation. When they arrived at her house, Eric watched as she fumbled with her keys, her movements mechanical. She finally managed to unlock the door and stepped inside, her posture slumping with exhaustion. "I should go," Eric said softly, not wanting to intrude on her private grief. Rebecca turned to him, her face etched with gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you, Eric," she said, her voice barely audible. "I need to process this. I need to think." Eric nodded and watched as she closed the door behind her. He knew that this was just the beginning of the fallout, that the pain and confusion would ripple through all their lives. But he had done what he felt was right. The truth was out, and now the chips would fall where they may. The next morning, Eric received a call from Jessica. Her voice was frantic, and she barely managed to contain her panic. "Eric, we need to talk." "Rebecca, she's devastated. I never meant for any of this to happen." Eric listened, his heart hardened. "I'm sorry, Jessica," he said, his voice cold. "But I'm done talking." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of chaotic emotions and public fallout. The affair became the talk of their social circle, the gossip spreading quickly. Jessica and Tom's relationship unraveled as their betrayal became public knowledge, their once secure world collapsing under the weight of their actions. The impact on Rebecca was profound, and while Eric didn't know the full extent of her pain, he hoped that in time she would find a way to heal. Eric continued with his life, but the experience left a mark on him. He found solace in small things, his work, his friends, and the new beginnings that awaited him. The betrayal had taught him a harsh lesson about trust and love, but it had also shown him the strength he had within himself. One evening, as he walked through the city streets, he felt a sense of closure. The weight of the past few months had lifted, and he finally felt a sense of peace. He had faced the betrayal, confronted the people who had wronged him, and taken control of his life again. Eric knew that the scars from this experience would remain, but he had emerged stronger, more aware of the complexities of human relationships. As he looked up at the city skyline, he felt a quiet sense of resolve. Life would go on, and though the path ahead might be challenging, he was ready to face it with a renewed sense of purpose and strength. And as he walked away, the city lights reflecting in his eyes, Eric knew that while the past could never be changed, the future was his to shape.